Good morning. Thank you, Mick, for the introduction. Good, that's up. So I tend to put this picture up when I speak, just to convince you that I'm older than 17 years old. So I often get accused of being a lot younger than I am. So I do. This is my family. I have three boys. You can pray for me: 14-year-old boy, 12-year-old boy, and a 9-year-old boy. So we are in the thick of it. But it's really been fun to watch our kids begin to mature and take hold of their own faith. And that is what you guys do here at Cornerstone University, is continue that process of helping men and women take hold of their faith for themselves. So I want to spend some time this morning hopefully casting some vision for the Ron Blue Center here at Cornerstone University. And to do that, I want to kind of talk about a little bit about my story, but also a little bit about this country. So the introductions have been consistent, and they'll be pretty consistent with my theme. So this is a quote I saw recently by Voltaire, who was a poet and author and rather a vocal critic of the church. In 1760, he wrote this: "When it comes to money, all men are the same religion." As a Christian, when I read that, I think, man, I really want to argue with that. That can't be true of us, right? That cannot be true of us. But then as I pondered it and I thought about it, I thought, man, as an honest Christian, maybe that is true about us. And if that is true about us, then it is a terrible indictment on us as a church. And so what do we do about that? So what I want us to do this morning is I want us to imagine a world where graduates of Cornerstone University and many other universities can be looked at as people who don't worship money in the same way as everybody else does. And you can look at them and say, they're different. So I grew up in a home, as you may have guessed by my name, I am Ron Blue's youngest son. You may not have guessed the youngest part because that's not implicit in my name. But I am the youngest of 5 children. So I grew up with a father who literally wrote books on this subject. We were his test cases. I was tithing my baby food when I was being fed it. But I knew the right answers, right? I knew how to save. I knew I was supposed to tithe. I knew I was supposed to avoid debt. I knew all of these principles. But the challenge for me was always, how do I attach my faith with my finances? Because I know the right answers. And thankfully, I grew up believing in Jesus really my whole life. But I can tell you from experience that it is entirely possible to tithe, to save, to spend within my income, to avoid the use of debt, and be totally in bondage to money. I'd say it all kind of came to a head for me in around 2012, about 7 years ago. I had been working as a big firm attorney for, about 7 years. And, we had moved to Austin. I started in Dallas and we moved to Austin. And we were living in a very nice home just a couple miles from downtown Austin. Our kids were doing well, and I was bored. I was empty and I was bored. I was doing it right. I was doing it by the book. And I was empty. I thought, is this really the abundant life of Christianity? At this time, I began to read a series of books that began to challenge my own disregard for others, frankly, and my own selfishness and how I looked at money and pursued it. It was like I had checked the boxes and I could move on from those things. And so I began to think, well, maybe I can use my law in some sort of a ministry capacity. What can I do about that? So I began to explore a job with a group called the International Justice Mission. International Justice Mission, if you're familiar with it, is a group that works they're primarily known for their work with human trafficking. But they also work in Africa with a lot of police abuse of power and things of that nature. Land grabbing of widows is a big deal. So I thought, you know what, maybe I can use my law degree in this way. And so I applied for a job and I was offered a position in Nairobi, Kenya. The story I could tell you is clear that God was working on it. We sold our house in a day without ever listing it. Literally, my wife just told someone as they were walking to school, hey, we're thinking about selling our house, and they came and gave us a contract. Like, God, are you leading us to go? I'm not sure if you could be more clear. And it was very clear to us that God was opening door after door after door You know, you get in one of those seasons and everywhere you look, like you see someone with a bag in the mall that has International Justice Mission on it. You're like, how in the world? So it's one of those, it was just kind of over and over and over that we felt God opening these doors for us. When it came down to it, we had sold our house, we were ready to go, and we began to explore what it would look like to live, and we got scared. And we thought, I just don't know if we can do that. Our kids were, 7 years ago, so they're 7, 5, and 2. And what is that going to mean for us as a family? And so we didn't go. We stayed home. We just said no. We're not going to do this. And at this point, for me, frankly, I was kind of fed up with myself. I was kind of done, and so I quit my job. Started my own law firm and began to go to seminary, and just tried to listen and say, God, what am I missing? Why is it hard for me to obey? So during this time, we have this service called Thanksgiving Back at our churches and at my church. And what it is, it's around Thanksgiving, we collect our benevolence offering. And it's you pastors in the room, you think this is crazy, I know, but we put microphones at the front of the sanctuary and invite people to come up and talk, right? Open mic in church is not always welcome. And so it was this Thanksgiving back, and people come forward, and they just say what they're thankful for the year, and that's our entire service. And so during this time, I felt the prompting of God, just the push to get up and say something about our pastor. Say, his family had meant a lot to us, and just, they're really a servant-oriented family. And so I began to have this, and I was really, frankly, nervous about talking in front of people. You may find that funny at this moment. But I didn't want to get up, and so I just sat there. And our pastor gets up to end the service, and he stands there behind the microphone, and this old woman in the back of the church who's in a wheelchair, I think, she stands up, she says, I just want to say thank you to the pastor and your family for how much you mean to us. And I always have a hard time with this story. And the conviction of the Holy Spirit came on me. He said, Michael, I don't need you to accomplish my purposes. I can use an old woman, a crippled woman, to do it, but I want you to be a part of what I'm doing. I want you to be a part of what I'm doing. And that was it for us. It's the moment I realized my unwillingness to trust God in simple things, which kept me from trusting him in really big things. And so it became a process for my life, and we want to say, God, you are enough for me. If you take it all away, I can still stand before you and say, you're enough for me, because that is what I need. I don't want to be, like Voltaire said, I don't want to have the same religion with money like everybody else does. And so that's why I love what I get to do now, because I am still in this process of trying to let go. I am far from a completed work. But we're learning to trust God. We're learning to say, it's yours. What do you want us to do with it? And so then I get to come along, young people, and say, let's not walk down. Let's try to help you hold this with an open hand and say, God, it is all yours. What would you like me to do with it? And so whenever I teach about money, whenever I come and teach people about money, the most important question I have to ask myself is my advice any different than the world's advice? And should it be different? Sometimes it's really nuanced, where our advice may be different, but the nuance is where it all matters, because it all points back to the heart. And if we get that part wrong, then what follows out is just going to be a trail of incorrect living towards God. So what I believe is that we can teach people everything that is right in accordance with Scripture and still miss God. And so that's the nuance. That's where the key comes in. And I think the even more important danger is we can teach people everything that's right and end up removing the need for God. And that is a really, really, really dangerous thing that we need to avoid. When we can look at God and say, you know what, God, I've got this. I've got it taken care of. You can go worry about the other people. I've got it all taken care of. So here's the issue that Voltaire's quote raises to us as people thinking about how do we educate young people is how do we keep from worshiping the same things that everybody else does? And I think Romans 12:2 gives us some fantastic guidance. Romans 12 is kind of the moving point in Paul's letter to the Romans. 1 through 11, Paul has been telling us, you are very sinful. Whatever you think you deserve worse, and you have no hope except for the risen Christ. That's what he tells us in chapters 1 through 11, right? And then he moves, he pivots and says, so now what? Therefore is what 12:1 starts with. In 12:2 he says this, he says, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I have come to just love this verse and its application for us. The word world means this age, so it's the methodologies, the beliefs of this age that we live in. And there are two really key verbs here, and I underlined them so that I wouldn't forget them. But it's conformed and transformed. Now, if you go to English, and everyone loves an English lesson, but these are both passive verbs. And what that means is there's somebody acting on you. You're just kind of passively receiving what is happening. So conformed as a passive verb, Paul says, do not be conformed to this world. So this implies that we're being changed by the things acting on us at a subconscious level around us. So we live in this world and this culture, and things are just happening to us, and they're automatically helping shape us. This can happen in a church too in a good way, but it happens when we surround ourselves with culture of a certain kind, it begins to mold us. Because that's what it does. It just wants to conform us to itself. And so what I know is that when I allow the values of this age to influence me like this without ever pushing back on it, then I begin to evaluate everything as if this age was more important than the one to come. And when I do that, it has devastating consequences on my relationship with the Father. When I evaluate everything as if this age is it and there's nothing to come, that is going to have devastating consequences. And that's what this world is trying to convince me. Let's get everything I can now, because this is all there is. But the other word he uses here is transformed, which is also a passive verb, but he gives us a key. He gives us a clue to what we're supposed to do. He says, renew your mind. We're told to be changed by God's grace and his word. When we renew our minds, we set it on his word. We set it by being obedient to his commands. And so Paul tells us very explicitly, you have to actively renew your mind in order to be transformed. You have to do something intentionally in order to counteract what the world is trying to do to you. It's not just going to happen on accident. It needs to be intentional. And so we've got these two verbs, one with the subconscious act, the other where we are actively seeking Christ and his word. So what we know by this is that we're going to become like the things we surround ourselves with. Intentionally or unintentionally, we're going to become like the things we surround ourselves with. And so if all of our time is spent pursuing and consuming things of this world, then it is going to be a miracle if our minds are set on things of the world to come and our minds are set on Christ. It will not happen without actively renewing our minds. And so we need to teach people, we need to teach students, we need to look at ourselves to choose to move towards God intentionally in this way. But what's so cool about this word is transformed is it's actually, the root of this word is where we get the word metamorphosis. And so I always love this because I think of a butterfly. I think of a caterpillar going into a cocoon. And what it is it's a change of essence. It's a total change in our character. So transformation is not just a shaping like the world tries to do. It just tries to make you look like it. They doesn't care what you think. It just wants you to look like it. So it feels okay. But transformation happens in our essence. And so it's like a butterfly coming out of its cocoon and throwing it off as this picture that I have with metamorphosis. And it's lasting. It's everlasting. And so understanding this, understanding that the world is trying to make us look like this, I think one particular danger, and we're going to talk about this morning, you're not surprised, is money in this way. The world tries to shape us to look like it with money all the time. And here's a warning that Jesus gave to us that you're familiar with. In Luke 16:13, he says, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. What's interesting is that money is the only idol that Jesus singles out in this way. And he doesn't say it's difficult to serve God and money. He says it's impossible to serve God and money. I read this quote recently by a man named Douglas Jones, who said this. He says, Jesus affirmed mammon as the sole serious competitor to the Trinity. Jesus understood the antithesis or contrast between God's way and mammon's way as the most fundamental distinction in all of life and history. Typical Christians tend to shrink mammon into one of many small idols. For Jesus, mammon wasn't one idol among many equals. He singled it out as the direct competitor to God. He never contrasted the idols of sexuality in God or knowledge in God, though these were idols too. He singled out money as the competitor to God. And mammon is the word that many translations use. The one I used, I know said money, but mammon is how this is often translated. And mammon is a more complex concept than just money. But it does include money, and it's really this idea of money as God. It's putting money in the place of God. It's where I put my trust, my security, my hope. And so it becomes this spirit of that's where I look for my security. That's where I look for my safety. I'm always looking to money instead of God. And Jesus says, you cannot serve me when you put money in my place. Those are my jobs. So what I think thinking about this Romans 12:2 verse and thinking about how it's conforming us, I think money and mammon have become the primary discipling mechanism we see in our culture. Quite simply, it is the primary discipling mechanism in our culture, and it's not by accident. As I said earlier, whatever we surround ourselves, the culture we surround ourselves has this effect on us. And if we think about the prosperity and everything that happens in our culture, money is what's discipling us and teaching us what we should desire. What's interesting, too, about this is how intentional this has been. Coming out of the Great Depression, there was this culture of thrift that existed in our society. People had learned that they don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. They don't know if they're going to eat tomorrow. And so they had to protect every little thing. They would reuse things over and over and over and over again. But coming out of the Great Depression, World War II happened. And we sent men overseas to fight, and the women moved into the factories, and they became productive. And we became a behemoth of production. The U.S. was producing like nobody ever had, and the war ends, and everybody comes home. All these men come home. And you now have a double workforce that you need to feed. And this productivity just continued to build on itself. And people began to realize the power of production and the momentum of production. This is another interesting quote by an economist in the 50s named Victor Lebeau. He said, our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, replaced, and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate. We need this to feed our enormously productive economy. And so out of this came the rise of the advertising industry, right? And words like perceived obsolescence and planned obsolescence were created. Literally, things were created to feel old. If you have an iPhone, you know this feeling. If you have one more than 2 years old. They build them that way on purpose so that someone can look at it and say, oh, you've got the old one. Planned obsolescence, they literally make things to break when they could make them last a lot longer so that we need to continue to consume. I find this fascinating. The rise of television happened in this time as well. Did you realize that TV existed for advertising? They used to call the shows that went between the ads filler. TV came into existence so they could have a place to tell you about their goods. It was the rise of all of this. And today, on average, we are exposed to between 4,000 and 10,000 advertising impressions every single day. Don't try to count. It'll make you crazy. I'm probably wearing 6 of them right now. But if we don't counter this, like Paul tells us to do, then people will be led to worship mammon, if nothing else, by the sheer volume of voices that exist that are screaming at them to do so. And so I believe if people are not equipped, if we don't equip young people in this, they will go out defenseless into the world. And they won't know the difference. Because frankly, people in our churches aren't living that differently. And so they're not going to see it there either. So we need to start teaching them earlier and earlier and earlier. And they can help go into our churches and help say, look, we need to look differently. Not just to be different, but because it's a better way of living. There's a fairly consistent picture in Scripture where Jesus says that we have to choose. We saw this in Luke 16, but if you read Luke, which he talks a lot about money in Luke, but if you read the Gospel of Luke, you see it, the risk and the danger of money over and over and over. And there's one particular story, parable that Jesus tells that always kind of haunts me. And I would encourage you to read this. It's in Luke 12. I would encourage you to read it in its entirety in context. I don't have time to set the whole thing in context. But if you read the sequence of all of the questions, the parable, all of the answers of how they go together, you'll say, oh, I never thought those stories went together because they're always taught independently. And you'll get a picture for this flow that Jesus has with money. But we're going to focus on the parable of the rich man, which is Luke 12, verse 16. It says this, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? Now, this is the right question. This is the right question. What shall I do with what I have? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. He's figured out how to make wealth. He's figured out how to keep wealth. I mean, frankly, if someone told you this story by itself, you'd say, good for you. Well done. You figured out how to make money. You figured out you didn't have a place to store it, so you found a more efficient place to keep it. That it'll last longer, so that then now you can relax, you can eat, you can drink, you can be merry. Using the word store is looking in the future. Effectively, I think he's reached what we would call the American dream. He can enter into his latter years at leisure. He can relax, he can eat, he can drink, he can be merry. But God said to him, it says in verse 20, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. This is a hard parable. See, this man's problem was his trust was in mammon and not in God. He was concerned with his leisure and not with his Lord. He was living for the future and not for eternity. He was rich. He laid up treasure for himself and was not rich toward God. It all began with his heart and where the direction of his heart pointed. And so this is the rub. This is the rub that we have here, and it's hard. How do we teach people to be responsible? Right? How do we teach people to be responsible? Saving is not a bad thing. I'm not saying, how do we teach them to be responsible? Live within their means. Do these things that we need to do. As I told you, I did, but I missed it. So how do we teach people to be responsible while leading them to be rich toward God? Knowing that there's a competition going on between money and between mammon. I think part of it comes in defining what it means to be responsible. And this is hard, because it's deeply ingrained. But what does it mean to be responsible? And I think it starts at the end here. So after Jesus tells this parable, it says he turns to his disciples, and he tells them something we're very familiar with. He says, do not be anxious about anything. He begins in that. He talks about the birds of the air and lilies of the field and how he cares for those people. He says, don't worry, don't be anxious. And then he says this we often don't, I don't think, hear this in that context. He says, fear not, little flock, for it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. It's my good pleasure to give you the kingdom. And he says in 33, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I think we're familiar with the treasure principle, but we usually use it out of Matthew. It's not quite as direct as this one. Jesus is contrasting barns and eternity. He is saying, put your faith in eternity and don't hedge. Don't hedge your bets. Don't hedge your bets just in case I don't come through. He's saying, you have a choice. You can put your treasure and your trust in your barns, or you can choose to put your treasure and your trust in me in eternity. And that is a choice we all must make, and it's a choice that students need to understand they are going to have to make. What if our students, what if the students at Cornerstone University, what if we as a people approach this passage, these words, not with fear that God's going to call me to do this? That's great for some people, but God, please don't call me to do this. Instead of fear, but excitement to say, God, I am ready to go wherever you call me to go, whenever you call me to go there. I just want to be a part of what you're doing. I just want to be a part of what you're doing. Because I want to use it all for your glory, because that is its purpose. Whether I have a lot or whether I have a little, my goal is to use it to glorify your name. Period. So if this is what you want me to do, it's yours. What if that were their attitude when they walked out this door? Man, that would be exciting. I don't believe that if we all took this command seriously, to store up treasures in heaven this way, that we'd be the last generation of Christians because we gave it all away. God has more in his barns than we can store in our barns. And he will provide our needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. Always. I think we'd see an Acts type of world change if we began to embrace this. I really do. People would look at it and say, that's weird. And then they would say, that's powerful. And they would say, I want to be a part of that. I think it's short-sighted for us to live for 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, instead of 50 million years from now. We have to ask ourselves, where can I get the best return, not in 50 years, but in 50 million years, and I need to pursue that. Imagine if God owns it all was not just a saying that we all nodded our heads to, but it was something that we lived into every day. I believe this is the world of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In Daniel 3, we see they're approached with this fiery furnace that they know is going to kill them, and all they have to do is bow down to the God of their age. And this is what they say to the king. They say, if this be so, if you're going to throw us in this furnace, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods and worship the golden image that you have set up. We will not worship your gods, your mammon. We will not do it. And if it costs us our life, so be it. But look at their confidence. He will deliver us from the fiery furnace. They had a hope of eternity. So we need to help people see that there is a choice, and we cannot serve both of these things. We don't want Voltaire to be right. We don't want to say all men are the same religion when it comes to money. One of my favorite missionaries to read about is a man named C.T. Studd. You may be familiar with him. If not, you should be. Remarkable man. He had been in China, and he had been in India, and he was home recovering from some illness, and he wanted to go to Africa. But nobody had ever been to Africa. This is the 1800s. No one had ever been to Africa as a missionary. C.T. Studd looked around himself, and he saw thousands of people going to the Congo because there were rumors of gold having been found there. But yet nobody had yet gone to the Congo for the spread of the gospel because it was too dangerous. He said this, If such men, these men who go for the gold, hear so loudly the call of gold and obey it, can it be that the ears of Christ's soldiers are deaf to the call of God and the cries of the dying souls of men? Are gamblers for gold so many, and gamblers for God so few? This is the battle. This is the attitude. This is the difference between financial literacy and biblical stewardship. They're fundamentally different. You may learn some of the same principles, but they are fundamentally different things. Imagine a world where we're graduating students by the thousands and hundreds of thousands with this idea, that they're more concerned with eternity than anything else. They're managing their money well. They're managing their money responsibly so that when God calls them, they say, I've got this massive anchor that's holding me back and I can't do it. So that they are ready, so that when there's a missionary in need, so that there's an orphan in need, they are there to be able to respond and meet that need. Where our churches meet the needs of one another as we live together in this way, where we say, there will not be people who are in need in my church, because there's enough that God has provided to us as a body. The problem isn't money. People talk about the fulfillment of the Great Commission, there's enough money to do it. The problem isn't money. It's never been money. It will never be money. The problem is hearts. And saying, God, eternity is my hope. And that's where I'm going to set my focus. That's where I'm going to set my vision. And I will not turn back. Except for that. And so that's what we're trying to do. So RBI, the Ron Blue Institute, was formed to help transform people's view on money. Cornerstone has partnered with us, and they say we want to help transform these students' view on money. And this isn't just some mild-mannered, hey, let's do this so these people can give more back to the university when they graduate. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to save them from the god of mammon. The purpose is to say, look, our hope in eternity has got to be real. And that's what was the conviction of my heart. And I am working hard to get there. And it's been so much fun. And so we want people to come along. So here's the goal. Our goal is that every Christian in North America will understand biblical financial principles, resulting in them seeking to live simply, work diligently, and give generously for the spread of the gospel to all nations. And in order to do this, we want to be a thought leader influencing the way Christians think, act, and communicate about financial decisions. And ultimately, our mission, the way we accomplish this, is by forming strategic alliances with Christian organizations and institutions to advance research and education, enabling Christians to make financial decisions with a biblical worldview. Now you understand what that means. That feels like a rather antiseptic definition. But that is what that means. These are the type of decisions we want them to be making. And so Cornerstone, we're working with Cornerstone to help. We've been on this journey for 6 years or so, so we're just trying to provide them with the materials, the expertise, the consulting, the back-end office. We have some partners, some grants that people have given us in order to help supplement the work that you're doing here. And so our goal is just to be a partner in whatever way we can with Cornerstone and cheer you guys on as you do this, as you own this, as your students graduate and they own this, as they go into their churches and they own this. And we want every student graduating from here to understand these principles, to understand that God owns it all, and understand the implications that that has on their lives, so that when they go out into the world, they will have some defense in the culture's attempts to conform them to themselves, to itself. These are our future pastors, our future counselors, our future teachers, our future business leaders, our future missionaries, our future parents. Those are the relationships that will change the way people think. I can give 1,000 speeches, but it is in these relationships, in the home, in the church, in a discipleship relationship where these discussions take root and where these discussions are worked out and where life change happens. And so that's why the academy is so strategic and so important, because that's where these conversations can flourish and take deep root, because there's freedom for those conversations. This is the most unique point in a person's life. They're together with peers, and they're all seeking and asking the same questions about what does it mean to live a life that glorifies God. This is so strategic to teach these students these things. And these will be our most influential people. They will be wildly influential. They will be our pastors. They will be our business leaders. And I'm so excited to just come alongside Cornerstone in this way. Chris Loisel is going to come up and talk a little bit about what Cornerstone is doing. But I just say, join us in this battle. It is worth fighting, because it's being fought on the other side. So let's fight back with it. Let me just pray for you before Chris comes up as we seek to make eternity our home. God, I pray that you would continue to work in my heart. You would continue to work in our hearts to understand a little bit more fully just the glorious depth of the riches that you have in your barns in eternity, and how a day in your presence, a second in your presence, is worth everything that we have. Help us know that there will never come a day where we stand before you and look at the things that we may have given up on earth and say, I can't believe I gave all of that up for this. We will stand and we will fall on our faces before you, and we will worship. And we will praise your name. And so I pray that you would help us just catch a vision for what it means to live this way. And we can move and we can change and we can just spread the glory of your name. God, I thank you and praise your name. Amen.